for all of those who stay the whole time, there'll be giveaways at the end of the session.
I never did that when I taught school. I always made them come because they were committed. I had colleagues that would pass out donuts early in the morning and candy and whatnot. I never did that. I made sure that they just showed up. But given the fact that the story is one that some people like to take with them, I have 2 books to give away. And for those who really don't want to read it, I have a candy bar, so it'll be kind of the consolation prize. But anyway, thank you all for being here. I appreciate that you're taking time, if you're doing research this week, that you're taking time away from your research. I know how you feel so tense in terms of how much can I get in the time that I have allotted. Jane and I have been to this type of program here 8 times, so we understand the intensity that you feel in doing your work. Today, I would like to do a story about a story, and essentially has 2 parts. The story in and of itself, you need to appreciate in order to see what public records I use to fill in the details. So hopefully we will be able to do that today. And this isn't going to work. Okay. My slides aren't moving. It's on.
So
Okay. Okay.
And then use them.
Okay. Okay. How many of you have found things through serendipity? You weren't looking, but you found it. Okay. And that's essentially the keystone in this story. My mother, back in the early 2000s, said to me one day, "Do you think you could find out who your grandpa's cousin was that died in the trolley accident in Pittsburgh?" I said, "Would you like to give me a little more information?" No, I never paid that much attention to it. I don't know what, and I really don't know whether they had conveyed more information or whether they just didn't talk about it, because 1917 was a whole different world and some things just never got talked about. So I dutifully went to the library, started to read newspapers from the early 1900s, thinking I may have to do a lot of reading, and found that trolley accidents and people getting injured or killed were very, very frequent in the city of Pittsburgh. You had, and I have some pictures later on, of the congestion. The city wasn't built for people as pedestrians, trolleys, automobiles and trucks, and then people still wandering about with horses and carriages and horses and wagons. So there was a lot of confusion in terms of who was using the streets at any one point in time. The trolley accident, from a bigger public perspective, was a tipping point. The city had become heavily populated in a short period of time, and people depended on public transportation. After industry developed, it pushed people to the hillsides, the hilltops, and as a consequence, they could no longer walk to work. Typically at that time, people were used to being close enough to work that they could walk, but when they got pushed further out, that was not the case, so they became very dependent on trolleys. Pittsburgh Railways was essentially the primary provider of service. They were interested in providing service, but not to the people who live close to the city or in the city. They pushed their rail lines out as far as they could go, hoping to create more opportunity for them to make money. And as a consequence, you had a large population towards the city that relied on transportation that was not always reliable. In December 1917, the Public Services Commission authorized close to Christmas an increase in the rate of the fare that people paid. So they were already not happy. And this accident, together with the fare increase, caused great public disturbance, disquiet. Local newspapers were essentially what I used to create a timeline. They were very, very good at keeping up with this story. And the story began in 1917, didn't end until 1935. But what I was able to do is through at home in our Carnegie Library, they have a great newspaper collection on microfilm. And I was able to accumulate a lot of the events that I then turned into parts of the story. One of the things too that unfortunate in Pittsburgh, and I imagine a lot of you have the same experiences, that you have libraries and archival resources that are very open and people who are willing to help. I can say that there was nothing, nowhere that I wanted that I didn't get. And when people heard the story, it made it even more, so they became more supportive and did things that I would never have imagined could happen. I would write an email and end up with files being sent because they wanted to be part of the story. And then lastly, one of the things that I wanted to do was create a record. There had not been an accumulation of material in any one place about this accident. And as a consequence, I decided that I wanted to put things together so that if people recognize family members, that they would be able to pick up a book and read about it in a way that's more than just a little article in the newspaper. And hopefully, and at the end, if we have some time, I'll show you some of the folks who have responded to me. Well, the story evolved from December 1917 through the Pittsburgh Railway's bankruptcy that extended from 1918 to 1935. This accident was the trigger for their bankruptcy. That's why it became part of the story. So the chapters in my book are essentially how this story unraveled. The serendipity. The Pittsburgh Post-Gazette has a daily almanac. And on the 24th of December, 2011, I went to visit my mother and I walked in the door and she handed me the paper and she said, "Hey, go figure this one out. See if this makes any sense." That on about midway down in 1917, the accident was identified. And I went back and looked at papers prior to that time. This was the first time it was mentioned. So the idea that we found it on that day was what I call serendipity. This is another encouragement I had to write. I don't know how many of you have ever heard of Jim Webb, but he was Secretary of Navy and he was in Vietnam and he reported on the war, and he also wrote a lot of books about the Vietnam War. Well, at any rate, one of my friends one day said to me, "Did you ever read this book?" Because he knew that I did family history research. And I said, "No, I hadn't." And like all researchers that we're not supposed to do, but we do it anyway, you go to the index to see if there's anybody there that you recognize. And in this case, without either the fellow who gave me the book or me really knowing, I opened the index, and there was Thomas Lackey, my sixth great grandfather. I opened to the page, and here's Jim Webb, who happens to be my cousin. Whether you like him or not doesn't make any difference. He did a lot of research in Lexington, Virginia, and he actually figured out where they were buried. My grandmother and grandfather were buried. And it was very strange to think that just out of nowhere, I find this book and it gives me information I didn't have before. So that's another reason why I wanted to document this. I had a great opportunity in 2017. The Post-Gazette used to have a page at the end of their editorial section where people could write about something of interest. So I contacted them and said, "It'll be 100 years since this trolley accident. Do you want a story about it?" They said yes. And that was my first opportunity to write about the story. Pittsburgh in 1917. Pittsburgh was a busy place. It had been the center for glassmaking, and probably at some point in the early 1900s, more glass was made in Pittsburgh than any place else in the world. This is a view from the tunnel where the accident happened, into the city. This was a commercial area. So if you went shopping in Pittsburgh, that's where you ended up. This is the Smithfield Street Bridge, and the trolleys went across this bridge. Congestion. Horses, trolleys, motor vehicles, all in the same place. Industry was taking over the city of Pittsburgh, and it wasn't glass making. The steel industry, heavy industry, started in the late 1800s, and by 1917, Pittsburgh was seen as a steelmaking capital. Even though the United States wasn't in the war, Pittsburgh became a point where munitions for the Allies were manufactured. What that did was the people who previously perhaps worked for Pittsburgh Railways saw that they could make more money by going and working in the munitions plants. That left a gap. People were not trained. There weren't enough, when we think about our labor force today, when you have gaps in terms of service industries and in other parts of our economy, back then they didn't have enough people to fill the jobs to provide services. And the first effort was to take people who were young and inexperienced. The second effort was to take women. Women became conductors. They never became motor people, but they did become conductors and maintenance people on the trolleys. So that kind of disruption was going on in the area in 1917 as a consequence of the war. Because of the heavy industry and the demand for munitions and other war material, the wage rates that were paid in Pittsburgh were relatively high compared to other places in the country that were not involved in similar circumstances. And one of the indicators that I found was that in December of 1917, the local population withdrew $1 million from their Christmas savings accounts, which was deemed to be a fairly large amount of money at that time. Pittsburgh had about 600,000 people. Allegheny County, the county in which it sits, was about 1.3 million. So it was a fairly populated place, and it was diverse. Somebody once challenged me and said, what do you mean diverse? And I said, just what I said. People lived in the city of Pittsburgh. About 20 to 25% were immigrants. And if you go through the city directories, if you go through the Hopkins map files, you'll find that there was no one place where the Germans lived or the Irish. They were in the neighborhoods. They were integrated in the neighborhoods. The one thing, though, that was kind of outstanding was that most people did not own their homes. They wanted to be mobile. And so there was a lot of moving around from place to place in order to get that next job. The first draft that affected those in southwestern Pennsylvania came in mid-1917. The second round of the draft came right before Christmas in 1917. So we had this mixture of emotions going on. People who were about to be deployed came back home for Christmas from Fort Lee in Virginia. The people, because they had resources, I believe, were very supportive. They not only because they had family members, but they used their financial resources to support organizations like the Red Cross. That at one time there was a discussion of the impact of war in the city, and it was concluded that almost all families had a membership in the Red Cross. And on Christmas Eve in 1917, almost every house had a light in the window to signify that their support for the people who were at war. The area that was most affected were these neighborhoods, and some of them were not part of the city of Pittsburgh. Over time, the city annexed these neighborhoods, but Belsuver and Knoxville and Mount Oliver, they were independent boroughs. So it created even more tension when you think about how do you coexist in a tense situation. Okay, the story that I was able to put together here. On Christmas Eve afternoon, you had an assortment of people who were going shopping, going visiting. In some cases, they were even going to the post office to mail packages. And at that time, they probably could go to the post office on the Christmas Eve afternoon and expect that there would be a delivery later in the afternoon. Because I know when I was growing up, we had mail delivery during the holiday season at least 2 times a day. So there were people taking their packages for last minute delivery. And then you had people who were just going to work. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the trolley that was heading towards the Mount Washington Tunnel had 120 people on it. It was built for 59. People were obviously sitting, but there were a lot of people standing. And with their packages and everything, their groceries and everything, they were crammed into this car. This is what is called the South Hills Junction, and this is where it all started. It was a trolley like this, and the South Portal. This is a picture from about that time. 2 tracks, one in, one out. And this is the exit. This is the tunnel, the north portal of the tunnel. This is the curve in the track. And this is what the trolley looked like. This is looking outward towards the Smithfield Street Bridge that I showed you a little bit earlier. And notice, this is not smooth pavement. Through the tunnel, it was like riding on a train rail where you had ties and rails. It was not smooth. The roads were not conducive to anything that we would appreciate today as being all right. That was Carson Street is the cross in the intersection, and this is what Carson Street looked like. The accident. One of the things that I found interesting is I can take this photo, and if you make it larger, you can appreciate how many people converged on this scene. This was almost immediate. Here's the car. What happened was when the motorman and conductor changed right before going into the tunnel, and the car was packed with 120 people. There were a number of cars backed up trying to get through the tunnel. When they had their turn to go into the tunnel, the motorman turned what they called a controller on to full speed. Full speed at that time was 50 to 60 miles an hour. The speed at which the motorman was supposed to go through the tunnel was less than 10. There's a 6% grade. And if anybody's been to Pittsburgh, we just have hills and valleys. And the 6% grade was sufficient to create a real problem for a trolley going more than 10 miles an hour. When the trolley got into the tunnel, the trolley came off the electrical wire, and the motorman didn't want to get out to put it on. So he had some words with the conductor, who was crammed into the middle of the car with all these people around him. He couldn't get out. The motorman from the car behind, I guess, decided that he had to do something or they would just be sitting there for a while. And so he got out, put the trolley on, got back into his car, gave the 2-bell signal, which was normal, and for the Knoxville car to proceed. The Knoxville car starts up again at full speed, goes about 3,200 feet. And the motorman decides that he was really going too fast and worked very frantically with their 3 braking systems on the car, and he couldn't get any of them to work. At the end of the tunnel, there is a curve. So you come out of the tunnel, go around the curve, and either go straight or to the right. When the car hit that curve, it turned over on its side because of the speed. At that point, it was probably going about 35 miles an hour. The car, when it slid, the top of it was, for about a half length of the car, was torn off the top of the car. The Pittsburgh car that it was, that was the name of the Pittsburgh car, had been designed by Pittsburgh Railways. And in the roof line, they had little vents, thinking that it would be more comfortable if they could open the vents in the summertime because they got to be so warm. Essentially, what that did was create an instability in the car. So when there were 2 poles on the sidewalk that the car hit, and it ripped off the roof. As I told you before, there were a lot of people standing, and those people tended to be the ones who were either seriously injured or killed in the accident. This is the car. This part of the roof was gone. There was a young man selling peanuts right here. He jumped out of the way, or he would have been hit by the car. So it was a close-in situation, and one of the commentaries that was published at the time said that after the accident, when people came pouring out of the buildings, the noise that was created was like people described as a bomb hitting the pavement. Black smoke from that essentially unfinished roadway rose, and so they poured out of the buildings to try to help. And one of the things that they found was body parts were 100 foot away. That was the force of the hit. This was one of the first notices to people that there was a problem. There aren't very many surviving photographs. I don't know whether it was simply because it was too fast. And Pittsburgh Railways wanted to clean up the accident scene as soon as they could possibly remove everything. So what we have is essentially what I have been able to include in the book. This is what the tunnel looks like today. Not much change, except that the floor has been paved so that buses can go through the tunnel as well as trolleys. This is the south end of the tunnel, and you can see the curve as you come out. I mapped the victims. The map that I showed you before, they were neighbors. There was hardly a street in Knoxville, Beltuver, Mount Oliver where you didn't know somebody. What I did was, there were lists in the newspaper of people who had either died or were victims in the accident. And I took that list and researched using public records to figure out who these people were. Find out how many were immigrants, how many were local in terms of their existence. And I think I was fortunate in that I was able to identify 120 or so people. Some of they were not all on the trolley. Some were the folks who helped with the rescues. Some others were involved in a special way, but I was able to create a list of 120 people. And that is part of the appendix to the book. I was able to find pictures. We had 6 to 8 local papers at that time serving Pittsburgh and its adjoining neighborhoods. And even though they're not perfect, They can show, showing us who was it that was affected. Some of them, in some cases, you had sisters who died in the accident. In many cases, you had individuals who were injured or killed, also had other relatives on that trolley with them. And then there were just some plain old good stories. Wesley Jones wanted to be in the army, and he got rejected. He wasn't a very big kid. So the United States ends up in the war. Wesley Jones gets to go be part of the army. He was so happy, but he did not survive the accident. These folks are interesting because the mother, she was the second wife of Henry Rosenberger. She had several children of his. When he passed away, she became the breadwinner of 9 in a household of 9. She was a seamstress, and she was unable to work after that because her arm and leg had been affected. Henry Rosenberger was just a young kid. He survived, ended up being a newspaper reporter in West Virginia. And the reason I'm saying this is that a little bit later you'll see why. And then Elfrida was was a phone operator and one of the more severely injured people. And of court records relating to civil cases that were brought, she was a person that the trial was of interest because Pittsburgh Railways fought all the claims very, very vigorously because he didn't want to pay people. At that time, if you lost wages or you had medical bills, that was your problem. You got on the trolley, you paid your fare, and then you became responsible for anything that came after it. Pittsburgh Railways did not want to do that. So people had to sue to try to recover. And one of the things that I found that when you think about valuing, a woman lost her fur coat because among that crowd that converged, there were looters. So the Christmas packages and the handbags and other things that were strewn across the road got picked up, and one was her coat, and a jury awarded her $10,000 for the loss of her coat. That was more than what people received in terms of lost wages or medical bills. It was really an eye-opener. This is about a woman who was a housekeeper. She had gone to the cemetery to put a wreath on her husband's grave. She went into, I think it was, she lived in Bloomfield, which is on the other side of Pittsburgh. So she probably took several trolleys to get to the cemetery and then go back home. She was a live-in housekeeper. And when she didn't return, it was her, Mrs. Chaplin, her employer, that went to the morgue and found that she had died. But what I was able to do is actually find evidence of where her husband was buried and who she was. She was an immigrant, who her parents were. And so I think it was satisfying to be able to say she was a person. She just wasn't a name on a list. Okay, to the research. What I was able to do is divide in terms of how I wanted to deal with this topic. What public records were available? What kinds of details could I find? And then where am I going to get them? As a former public servant, I was fairly familiar with the public records systems that in local, state, federal levels of government. So that wasn't a challenge. It was figuring out where they were held. It was probably the biggest question. Could they be accessed over the internet, or would you have to go in person and literally go through a process to request? And I spent my summer in Allegheny County Civil Court in their records division because they would only let me have 5 records a week. 5 records a week. And on top of that, nobody in the world had gone back to 1917, 1918. And so they had to go dig them out. Sometimes they were there, sometimes they weren't. There were 68 cases filed as a consequence of this accident. And over the course of the summer, 5 at a time, I spent my summer with the staff in this office. And what it did was that by the end of summer, everybody knew what I was looking for. And they would say, sorry, we couldn't find anything. Or yes, we found something and hopefully it'll be of value to you. I relied a lot on Ancestry.com because we are fortunate that our birth and death records, as well as coroner's records, sometimes can be found on Ancestry.com, in addition to census records and city directories and other things. So that was a mainstay. Newspapers.com. After I spent weeks in the library looking at microfilm, newspaper.com opened up a new segment, and I was able to get at most of that microfilm from home, which was a real help because every time I wanted to check something, I didn't have to go back to the library, but I could use newspapers.com. Pennsylvania has a trolley museum and they have a library. And I said, do you have anything? Sure, we'll send it to you. And I got a packet of materials, some of it helpful, some of it not, but they were very good. Port Authority of Allegheny County gave me tunnel construction drawings from 1904. What was that tunnel like? There's one exhibit that shows you what it was like. And they didn't give me any kind of trouble. Generally, you have to go through a request system and wait 6 months. And I told them what I was looking for, and they emailed me scans of the pages from the drawings, and I go back and say I need some more, and they keep sending them. So somebody must have either not had much work to do or got curious about what was going on. The Pennsylvania Historic and Museum Commission is located at the state capitol, and they had the posters where kids bought stamps for war bonds and other things that I thought were indicative of the time in Pennsylvania. And they were very good at giving those to me too. Site visits: Carnegie Library, Heinz History Center. I guess I've left something out there. Allegheny County court records, civil and criminal. The History Center, Library and Archives. University of Pittsburgh's library system has an archives that's excellent. And I found that the coroner's records from the time were held at Pitt. And I went to the library on the 26th, the 27th, I called the coroner's office and said, where are your records? And they said, oh, they're at the archives at Pitt. So I called the archives at Pitt and I said, I'd like to look at these records. And he goes, well, it'll take a couple of weeks. 10 minutes later, he called me back. He said, when are you coming to look at these? That they had a whole box full of stuff that I could look at. Not only coroner's reports, but the inquest with testimony and the decision of the jurors. And it was a treasure trove. And then National Archives and Records Administration. Luckily, the bankruptcy records for Pittsburgh Railways was held in Philadelphia. If I went today, I would have to go to Kansas City because they moved the records. But when I was looking, I went to Philadelphia and they said you had to order them ahead. I went to bankruptcy records, and the day I went in, a cart came out with 12 boxes of records. And like all of us, we've had this experience. What I was looking for was in the 12th box at the end. But I found what I was looking for. I used census data to describe Pittsburgh in 1917. I was able to look at the individual municipalities as well as the neighborhoods. Department of Labor put out great reports, talked about occupations, talked about wages, talked about whether there was an increase or decrease in any particular part of any sector of the economy. And so it was very useful when it came time to try to capsulize what was going on in Pittsburgh at that time. Hopkins maps are a wonderful resource. I love maps, especially if they're colored, because they just give you energy. Hopkins, on a rotating basis, would produce the maps, update them. And what you can actually do is look at a Hopkins map and see who lived in a house on a street where you might be looking. So it was a very, very good. And in addition to homes, there were churches, cemeteries, schools, roads, railroads, anything. They were very good. And my next, and that's the segment. This is where the tunnel was, and this is the bridge. So you can visualize what the area looked like. This is an earlier version, and the reason I like it is this is the tunnel. It goes underneath the streets of Mount Washington. So if you're sleeping on this street, the tunnel is underneath you. So. The victims, as I said earlier, census data, passenger records, naturalization records. A lot of those are on Ancestry.com, and they became very helpful. Allegheny County has a real estate assessment website, and because it's not something that was updated all that often, I found the original picture of the house that existed in 1917 and city directories. Because we didn't have telephone directories back at that time, city directories made up for it. So when I was looking for somebody, oftentimes the newspapers didn't give really accurate information. You know, if somebody is on their way to the hospital and somebody's with them, says, well, you know, it's their address is what sometimes it wasn't quite that way. So I was able to use the city directories to get closer to the individuals. And then I used the city directories to get me to the census and organize which information was associated with which person. My grandpa and grandma came from Austria to Pittsburgh he came in 1910, she came in 1914. They were part of a chain migration process. And the cousin who died in a trolley accident was came in 1909. Prior to that time, in 1907 and 1908, other members of the family came to Pittsburgh. So this is definitely chain migration, and they tended to cluster in certain neighborhoods. I still had the quandary of who was the cousin who died in the accident. Found the information about the accident, but the question still remained: was there a connection to my family in regard to this accident? So I thought, how am I going to do this? There was a list of victims, and that very first report came out in the newspaper. And I thought, okay, let me look at the list. Her name isn't going to be Smith, Miller, Jones. It's going to have a Germanic sound look. First person on the list, Mrs. Leo Zerny. Okay. Now what do? I look for an obituary. Mrs. Leo Zerny was Aurelia Kuffner, based on her obituary. And that's how I found her. She was the mother of 7 children. The youngest was 3, the oldest was 21. The death certificate was filed some time later, gave me a little bit of information, her age, and then the cause of death. Her entire body was crushed. And it showed me, maybe it didn't show me, place of burial, St. George's Cemetery. For some reason, in the newspapers in the next 2 days, her story was part of the bigger discussion. And when I started to read about Christmas and the preparations that had gone on, it's just like I had when I was a little kid. That made it really powerful. I don't even know what she looks like, but it seemed like here's Christmas in their family. They were going into town to buy Christmas presents, and they had hidden the tree from the kids. And these are all the kinds of things that I had growing up. The sad thing is, the oldest son was in downtown when all this was going on. And like the crowds were going from place to place, hospital to morgue. He went to the morgue, found his mother. He wasn't looking for her. He just found her. And this talks about what the people at the morgue who worked there tried to do to keep people away from him and keep him calm so that somebody could come and pick him up. The father was injured, so you have 2 parents, 7 kids. Nobody to take that leadership place or that authority place from him. So they were lost. Passenger records, they came, mother and 2 daughters, father and 2 sons came, 2 separate voyages, and I was able to find both. And these are the passenger records out of Germany. Naturalization records tells us which kids were born in the United States, which ones were not. Talks about occupation and they wanted to become American citizens. This was quick. You had a 5-year waiting period as soon as they were able. And let's see. This is the Hopkins map, and this is where they lived. And the picture of the house. Census record 1920 is important because most of the family no longer lived in Pittsburgh. The father couldn't take care of the children, so most of them went with the older brother who lived in Detroit at that time, and essentially were treated as children of the brother. That in the census records, it lists them as children in that family. The father moved from Michigan to West Virginia. At some point, he was able to work again, and so he went back into the glass industry. This is 1917's Pittsburgh Directory, and it talks about Leo the father, Leo the son, and there was Theodore was also old enough to be in the workforce. Coroner's records, everybody was had a press release as well as a more technical record. I'll just go through these quickly. Everybody after the coroner's inquest had associated with their record the recommendations of the coroner's jury. It wasn't so much that the coroner's jury was returning a verdict about Pittsburgh Railways or the motorman or the conductor. They wanted Pittsburgh Railways to do something with the curve at the end of the tunnel so that nobody else would have the same problem. That was the main thrust of their decision making. The district attorney in Allegheny County decided that he didn't want to try the motorman when charges were placed. 23 people died. He took 2 or 3 rather cases that he thought he could substantiate, and he took the motorman to trial. The motorman was had a jury. The jury decided that in one case he could not be held responsible because the attending physician was in the military in Europe at the time of the trial and not able to testify. So the other 2 counts were held, and he received a sentence of 2 years. When it came time to try the other cases, there was some kind of a glitch, we might say today, where he would be subject, the motorman would be subject to double jeopardy. So the district attorney withdrew all the other charges. But I was able to capture materials from the inquest. When he went to jail, this is his intake. His name was Herman Klinger, H.H. Klinger. He went to jail, and the only picture I have of a person other than those newspaper pictures is the motorman. National Archives, I mentioned that the last box, almost the last item in the box. This is a complete record of all the civil court verdicts and what they owed people. In bankruptcy, they were able to hold off paying from 1918, 1919 till 1935. One of the things that I cringe when I hear about Mellons and Carnegies and Fricks and Westinghouse, they all owned Pittsburgh Railways. They owned Pittsburgh Railways to make money. They also owned gas, electricity, railroads, not trolleys, but railroads. They owned a significant part of the economic resources in the city of Pittsburgh. And they essentially had significant influence over everything that went on. But I was at a program a week or so ago where one of the folks who had acted as Deputy Attorney General for the United States talked about Pittsburgh in the early 1900s as being one of the most corrupt places on a political level. And I had to sit there and say, yeah, and I can prove it, because this is the kind of thing that we have as a consequence. That's the trolley drawing, the construction drawings. And that's what the trolley looked like when it was done. This is the roof line that was torn off. And this is actually, it was a 4200 car, and this is the 4200 series. So it was exactly like this. The framing becomes interesting. The interior, the conductor was here. The emergency brakes were here, but he wasn't able to apply the emergency brake. The tunnel. Unfortunately, the grade, this is what a 6% grade looks like when you're going through a tunnel of 3,492 feet. The explosion, my nephew, who's a mechanical engineer, said that it was probably between about 12 sticks of dynamite if they'd exploded all at one time. That's what it would have been comparable to. After the newspaper article came out, I had a contact from the McCoy children. These two kids were on the trolley. They had gone to visit their uncle, and the uncle had given them an air gun. They were so thrilled. They told everybody on the trolley that they had just come from their uncle's. He died, and his brother survived. His little sister needed a new winter coat, and instead of going to her uncle's, mom and dad took her for a new winter coat. So she was fortunate enough. The woman who contacted me, her grandmother, this was her grandmother. I have a whole bunch of other pictures too that were just as sweet. The Rosenfelders were on the trolley. Robert Rosenfelder died. Angela survived. Angela's granddaughter contacted me, and she said, you know, my grandma used to remind us all the time of the trolley accident. She'd point to her head and she said that metal plate was an indication to the kids that they really needed to be tough. Can you imagine somebody having a metal plate put in her head in 1917? She had 7 children after the accident. I guess she was tough. The Rosenbergers, as I mentioned, Elfrida was the subject of a lot of coverage. She had facial and injuries to her arms as well as her face, and went through all kinds of medical activity. Whenever the case came to trial, essentially the Pittsburgh Railways attorney got up and said, she wasn't so pretty to begin with, so who's complaining now? The jury didn't agree and awarded her, I think at that time it was about $12,000. That was a lot of money. And essentially, this family got enough money to move to Florida. I think it was about be $75,000 in our current money. This is Aurelia Zerny's grandson. He lives in Illinois and contacted me after he read the book. And he was so happy that somebody had documented this accident that he as a little boy had been told about. So, and that's it. Thank you.